So gentlemen, thank you so much for giving us your time and to come and join us as a follow-up to the event the school held in February, um, when we dealt with the race issue. And it seems like prophetic wisdom that we engaged with that, and that this has become the topic that we can't ignore just now. So thank you for your time and giving us your space to share your knowledge and your insight into processing ideas that we had back then and how they have come into just crystal clear focus with the recent events with the triple killings of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and George Floyd. So in a way of introduction, we are joined by the now esteemed Jemar Tisby, whose book, The Color of Compromise, has soared to number 52 on all books on Amazon. Are you aware that it's that hyped right now?
I had heard tell of that, yeah.
and there is a brilliant little video series that goes along well with that on Amazon Prime also, which I'll just encourage you to see. Jemar is a pastor in Mississippi, and he runs the Pastor Mike podcast, which has been engaging with this issue for years now. His voice is prophetic, and we're so grateful for the work that you are doing. And I think for me personally, the thing that's most evident beyond the racial awareness and the history your book brings is your love for the church. And I think that's often a difficult thing to redeem, is when we look at the sins of the church and how it's handled in the race space, that your love for the church in spite of that is remarkable. And it speaks to me of forgiving the church for its sins. So thank you for your love for the church and writing this book to help us be better.
Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead and give an introduction to our other person who's going to be with us here today, Dr. Oscar García-Johnson. He's a personal friend. I want to tell you a little about him. He's an associate professor of theology and Latinx studies and the assistant provost for the Center of the Study of Hispanic Church and Community at Fuller Theological Seminary in California. He is a native of Honduras, but he immigrated to the United States. He studied electrical engineering before becoming a pastor. He served for a long time, or still does, with American Baptist churches. He was a minister, longtime church pastor, church planter, as well as a denominational leader with American Baptist, as I said. He's an exuberant lecturer. I've heard him lecture many times. He's a great speaker, and he teaches on ecclesiology and Christian leadership from the margins. He's the author of the recent book, Spirit Outside the Gate, Decolonial Pneumatologies of the American Global South. He's also written some other books as well, Conversaciones Teológicas del Sur Global Americano. He co-authored with Milken Acosta, Theology Without Borders. And he's also written The Mestizo Mestiza Community of the Spirit, a Latino Postmodern Ecclesiology. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
And we have the esteemed Dr. Ryan Gladwin, professor at Palm Atlantic University, and a mentor and a friend of mine. And I am Jordan. I'm a pastor at Memorial Presbyterian Church and a graduate. So gentlemen, as a first question, how are you doing right now with all that's happened between COVID and the racial violence that has exploded on our streets? And what has this exposed to you of the systems that we discussed when you were both here in February? And Jemar, would you like to lead us off on that question?
Sure. That's such a hard question to answer these days. I feel like even just ever since the pandemic, that question, how are you doing, is such a loaded and a layered one, because we're all feeling so many things at once. I'll highlight two things that I'm feeling. One, I'm feeling expectant, and two, I'm feeling exhausted. And so on the expectant part, this feels like a moment that's pregnant with possibilities, that anything could happen. It could go in a very positive direction, or it can go in the direction of the status quo, which is just unacceptable, particularly when we're talking about anti-Black police brutality. And so we're at this crossroads, and I'm feeling this kind of eagerness to see where we'll go, how fast, how far. But I'm also exhausted, perhaps not in the way people would think. I'm exhausted because I've been pulled and stretched a lot right now as people are clamoring for resources, for voices, for perspective on this racial moment. And so I'm grateful that folks are looking to me or this book as a potential resource, but it's also a reminder that the racial labor and the ethnic labor that people do is indeed labor. It is exhausting. I've had my schedule completely disrupted these past several weeks in order to fulfill what I think are pressing questions and urgent questions. And I do it because I feel called to it as a Christian. I do it because this is my life's work, is racial justice, but it does take a toll. So this is an extremely tiring time for those of us who engage in racial justice on a more or less full-time basis.
Thank you, Jemar. Oscar, can you respond?
Sure. I think the way I feel is I feel pretty much reminded, and that's kind of, it's not a feeling, but it's a state of mind, but it has an affection. I feel reminded of the fact that when we think we are dealing with some issues that are urgent and bad, we keep finding undercurrents that are worse, and they are invisible, and they're surfaced from time to time, and so it's like navigating in a lake when there are currents inside that are really deadly, and you think you're managing the wind outside, so you're navigating in the surface, and you're trying to use your skills, you're trying to both take the risks, move forward, develop the skills at the surface, and yet inside the currents that sooner or later will become evident in front of you. It will remind you that what you thought it was a danger was not necessarily that big of a danger, and everything is interconnected. And we seem to kind of forget the connectivities. And so that's where we get into these things called systemic, evil. And we're dealing with one little piece here, and yet the monster has multiple tentacles, and we're mastering these, and we think this is it. And no, in the United States lately, and I would say in our generation after Obama, we kind of gotten into this habit of saying, oh, okay, well, but this has happened before. And then we review history, but this has happened even worse before. And this is the latest interpretation I saw, which was very clever. He said, well, things like this have happened before, even worse, except they said, but that's a new thing, that at that time we still had a political tissue that was a little bit more willing to not put up with it. That's what we have right now. That's the latest interpretation that I've seen. That seems to be the different element right now, that we're captured in a bubble of political arsonism, and things that in a way doesn't help. If anything, it kind of becomes very combustive. And that is, I feel reminded, I feel apprehensive. I'm trying to find out what's going to be the connection. I'm looking for the connection. So I feel busy, I feel fatigued, tired, and I feel in deep solidarity with my African, American, and Black brothers and sisters of the whole world, which are part of my community, by the way. There's no Latin America without Afro descendants, and so they're part of my community. But I feel in deep solidarity, and so I feel part of it in one way or another, and very apprehensive of what's next. I see hope. Yeah, I see hope. I'll tell you where I see hope, but that's how I feel.
Well, thank you. Jemar, I'm going to start again with you with this next question, and then we'll move on to Oscar. What are you fearful of right now?
Yeah. I like the word Dr. Oscar used, apprehensive. I'm very apprehensive because, like I said, we're at this crossroads, and so it could go either way. And what I'm apprehensive about is that if we choose to go the route of the status quo, even with this one little piece about policing, as Dr. Ostersked said, it's all interconnected, right? And so when you single out one particular issue, you find that, oh, it's tangled up with all of these other issues, from mass incarceration to the racial wealth gap to health coverage and all of these things. But what I'm apprehensive about is that if we take the route of the status quo, it might be much harder to mobilize people in the near future. Because right now we're seeing this outpouring of support. It's this really dynamic coalition across races, across ethnicities. It's across the country. What began as protests in Minneapolis has spread nationally and even internationally in solidarity with Black people. And so we have this huge swell of momentum and energy right now. And I think a lot of people are expected. Can change occur? Is this the moment when we see some sort of watershed or some sort of turning point in the United States in particular? And then what happens if it turns out not to happen? I think it would be extremely discouraging for the people who are protesting right now. And when we get to the next incident, when we get to the next calamitous event that calls for protests and marches and lobbying and legislation, people are going to be like, why bother? We tried all that before and it didn't make a difference. So I'm a little bit anxious about that. I can say that history tells us that there's always going to be a remnant that rises up and challenges injustice. But the numbers we're seeing right now, the sort of mainstream getting behind this movement that we're seeing right now, I wonder if we'll be able to do that again in the near future if major changes don't occur right now.
I turn the question to Oscar. As you answer that question, what are you fearful about right now? Can you talk a little bit about relationship between African-American brothers and sisters and Latinos and some of the challenges there? And, you know, does it scare you at all to see movement happening over here? Is that going to help out Latinos, or is that a challenge as well to Latinos' efforts to kind of get ahead as well?
Yeah, I guess, you know, don't ask me why, but I've been thinking of Nero lately. I mean, honestly. And the year 64, June 19, when a blaze broke out in the shops around Circus Maximus, quickly spreading throughout the city. And what I am thinking is, what happened? I mean, Nero will not be charged of being the one doing the fire, or playing, fiddling. You know, there was no fiddle at that time. It was a lyre or something. But forget about those historical details. What I fear is how Nero took the opportunity to create the world that he wanted out of the chaos that he experienced, to kind of go about his will and use the chaos and, you know, and the unsettlement and the fear of the population. He was able to read that and kind of deflect the attention of bad leadership into building elements for what he believed was the right city. I am fearful that in a moment of emotional, you know, social, civil unrest, there are going to be people in power weaponizing this and, in a way, orienting the energy that you're talking about, Jemar, in ways that will not favor the very cause that we're really hoping, and the structures that we're really hoping, and the hearts and minds that we're really hoping to change. I am, and I think we've had 20 centuries to perfect that from the places of privileges. There is a whole mechanism, and what you're saying is, I think is very smart. I mean, if we don't take advantage of this, COVID helped us in a way, in the sense that there are forces that we cannot control. nobody can control, not even the government or a structure. So in that sense, the whole environment is polluted right now, it's composed. And so we're dealing with multiple things, and usually, you know, monopolic power cannot really deal with multiple elements at the same time, because it will not perfect its action. But I think I'm fearful of how this, and is already being politicized and is being derailed into other channels. And since we already are in a divided, polarized, segregated, you know, society, that it makes more difficult. For example, I am fearful that we don't have an evangelical voice that matters. I'm fearful of that, and I'm sorry for the people that's going to hear from me. What I mean, we don't have an evangelical voice that matters. I'm not talking about that we don't have people or church that they're doing a great job. They are. But I'm talking about, I would say, a sound, unified, communal voice that can speak, and people that are non-evangelical will listen. That's what I mean. Not the one that are part of our club. No, the ones that are saying, can we find any wisdom? Can we find any truth? Can we be led in this historical moment, even though I'm not, by this voice that seems to be grounded in reality and leading us into a constructive future? And I don't find that as a community, you know, as a communal voice. The church institution, the church establishment, it's right now in Christ. We don't find that. So let me stop there, because there's hope, but I don't find the hope there. I find this hope somewhere else. But speaking about the Latinx, I feel, if anything, I feel energized with what happened as a Latino, as a Latina, because I see a lot of us there in the streets and manifest. So the browns and black, I see ourselves together. I don't see this, you know, as subsuding the topics. And I hope that colleagues do not buy into this segregationist logic in which, okay, we're being overwhelmed by this, we have issues too. Yeah, well, any issue of my black brother is an issue that I better take into account, because we don't solve that, I'm going to be next. It's just irreversible. And I would say the same, because we might solve temporarily, momentarily, the African-American issue. But if we don't solve the brown issue, it's going to get back. So we're all entangled. We're all united by adversity, suffering, and injustice. So we better make out a people together. We better clear our histories and our memories and stop buying into these, you know, minoritized competition and you know, a little better in your scale or whatever, you know, that we buy into this system, colonial system. And we better try to undo that and unrest and create this chaotic brotherhood and sisterhood to move forward. And so I hope, you know, and I kind of seen that in my neighborhood, so to speak, that, you know, this is a time that we need to stick together with our African Americans and black brothers and sisters. But we're working in this because it's a system that at the end of the day, a color is just a political thing right now. It's going to get to you sooner or later in a different color, in a different flavor, in a different status, you know, it will get to you. So we better solve the whole system little by little, but together. So that's where I am right now in terms of that.
So your remarks bring up for me a few other fears or anxieties too, that if we have time, I just want to articulate momentarily. So I really appreciate your point about where's the voice of the church, particularly the evangelical church, if you want to think of it that way. And I think you're so right. I do see a lot of participation from Christians in what's happening. I even see some church leaders organizing marches and protests. But as we're looking, I think as a nation, for wisdom, for leadership, for perspective, I don't think many people, their first turn is to Christians, particularly to white Christians, right? And so that's not an issue of just this present moment. That's an issue that's been building for generations and for decades. Is that, I won't say the church has lost its prophetic voice. It's always there. The question is, where has it been directed? How have we been amplifying that voice? And who are we looking to? And so I think a change that needs to happen is that Christians, as well as people who are not Christians, we need to sort of decolonize the way we think about current events and about race, which partially means looking to Black and brown people to be those leaders and to be those voices. So I say the church has not lost its prophetic voice, because there are people and churches, but they're at the margins. And, journalists and news outlets and pundits and politicians aren't looking to the church at the margins for leadership. So that's one thing that I'm fearful of, is that because we're looking in the wrong direction, we would miss the leadership that prophetic voices can provide. Another thing I'm fearful of is just in terms of strategy for demonstrations and for change. So I think the movement for Black lives in the 2010s has made great strides, and they were very savvy to look back at the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and say, okay, that did some good, but there were some shortcomings that we don't want to repeat. In particular, they wanted to get away from two things. One, they wanted to get away from this figurehead kind of leadership that picked out just a few particular folks as the leaders of the movement, which then ignored or downplayed the grassroots coalition of people that were doing the hard work of change. And the other thing they wanted to avoid was the patriarchy and the misogyny that often went with the civil rights and Black power movements that gave all of the voice and all of the public power to men and overlooked the essential work of women. And so I think they're right in that assessment. I'm wondering, though, if, in response, you can go too far in a different direction. And so I think the movement in the 2010s has been very, very careful not to have that singular figurehead or spokesperson. And I totally understand that. But in this moment, in 2020, in the midst of these protests about George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and more, I do think people are looking for, if not the leader, at least spokespeople, folks who can clearly communicate the message of the movement. And I think that's difficult to find right now. Not that there aren't people who are saying helpful things, but who is the person who we can easily find to speak not as the sole arbiter of the principles of the movement, but on behalf of people. So I think that's still needed. I just think that's a natural human instinct to look for someone to put words to this thing. And then so that's one thing I'm fearful of, is that if we don't have that kind of at least loose leadership and community and even the organizations, which organizations are we looking at to help us maneuver this moment? I think that's harder to find. So I'm a little bit concerned, quite concerned actually, about what that will mean for the longevity of the changes that we're hoping to see.
May I interact? I'm sorry, what Jemar
Please,
said.
please.
For example, and 2 points, the last point you mentioned and the first point, I think the prophetic voice being lost, I agree with you, it's not being lost, it's active. But when you were talking for the first time, an image came to my mind. Is this.
Yeah.
Is the whole system. I think what has happened is that the prophetic voice has been channeled into private, economic. So we don't have it in the open space, in the plaza, in the public sphere. It's not there anymore because the system is so technologically driven. That is not like an open plaza where people will see, no, we are already conditioned to channels. So you have this market driven, you have this political driven, you have this sectarian driven, you have, and unfortunately, the prophetic voices don't have any public space because their spaces, they have to do in whatever space they are. And so we don't listen as a public voice. And I think that's part of what has happened. And in a way, it's complicated. In a way, it kind of resembles a little bit of what was happening in the first century when Christianity was emerging. So it's good and it's bad. Now, the second thing that I want to say to you about a single voice or single leader evoking for example, the Black Lives Matter, I think the time will be difficult to simply focus on one. And what I see from the outside, a little bit outside, because I feel inside, but a little bit outside, is that there is the gestation of multiple voices in multiple spaces with relevance, like you, like my brother Dwight, at Fuller, and other people that are emerging. So we might see in the next, and that's my hope, we may see in the more immediate future a coalition of voices that will have to find communal interest, political agency, civil appeal, and I hope theological wisdom in how to move forward to really articulate a multiple front, that will not be divided because it's not one head. It's really a community. That's where my hope is. And I think this is a moment of gestation. That's why key leaders like you are being bothered right now. And you're creating circuits. You're creating circuits or networks of people that are listening. And so I think the next layer, I hope, is that people like you are talking to others without this political rhetoric that we have to have our own little thing here, otherwise we won't make it in the future. No, this is about humanity.
I like that. Yes, it's a
gestational
period.
Yeah. If we don't solve this, we're all losing here. It doesn't matter what color I think I am. It depends. If I go to some places in South America, I'm very brown. If I go to other places, I'm going to be white. So it depends what color you think you are, right?
Thank you both. There's so much good stuff that you guys have worked through there. And so two little things I'll say before we move on to the next question. I think from all that both of you have said, the word that comes to mind is imagination. Is that so often the church has been reactionary in critical ways to social issues. And the imagination that the church used, as you so elucidate in your book, Jemar, to create racial structures. The church used their imagination to misread and to warp biblical texts, to support systemic systems of racism that I think our prophetic call right now is to re-engage the imagination to build tomorrow. And so often the Christian voice has been just reactionary to the present, that we need to build people towards something that's hopeful and something that we are dreaming towards and something that we actively use the imagination for good. And before we move on, can I just ask you, either one who wants to take this one, just for the listeners, when you say the phrase decolonize, can you just tell us what you mean by that? Because even like my homeland in the UK, the slaver Edward Colston had a statue in Bristol, England, and protesters ripped it down and rolled it 10 blocks and threw it into the sea. So the sins of colonialism and the sins of empire are as present in the UK. Like, you guys have your mess here because of us. Like, we gave it to you gladly. And so all Western powers are wrestling with this now. Even in downtown Brussels this morning, a protester climbed up a statue of King Leopold and tied a Congolese flag around it. Right. So can one of you just say, what when you see, what are you meaning when you use that phrase?
I think I'm charged with a little bit of that because of the title of my book, right? So right now, the decolonial is becoming very famous and propagated. And that, I like that, actually. I don't feel like, oh, they took my little baby here called no. I like that. The idea is just that the more we disseminate it, then we're going to have to do, we have to think about what we're saying. For example, the way I see the decolonial work or the decolonial task, I see it as a very situated praxis. It's a praxis. It's a practice. It's not just a theory, it's a practice. So I have to be in the ground, you know, thinking of, imagining in the ground as I walk the streets. I need to be thinking of the past, the present, and the future. What is working? What is not? And what may I see as a seed today of the future? And the shift that needs to happen to carry that seed and plant it, which means a very difficult task of having to deal with current, you know, structures that needs to be reformed, because if we simply undo those structures, we will have no future. But other structures will need to be undone. So it is a little bit of reform and it is a little bit of revolution. I've said that a little bit. So in particularly, the problem is that people like us that are in multiple places will have to do reform inside of some of institution and revolution from the outside when we walk in with the people on the same structure. So it's not simply a dismantling process, but it's a delinking, and it's a delinking. And in my opinion, like with other people, we say everything begins in where you are. If you're not able to locate yourself where you are, who you are doing this with, what are you doing this for, and then only then the cognitive, the theoretical cognitive, you know, elements play a big role. It's a reversal of the so-called Cartesian logic. I think, therefore I am. No, I am where I think, where I act, where I believe, where I do. So it's a little bit of a reverse. That's where, in my opinion, the decolonization begins. So then you have multiple elements that needs to be taken into account. Subjectivities. Who defines you are black and I am white, and why is that matters? You know, what are the systems that in a way create the human value in the scale? So, I mean, we interrogate that and they say, well, it might be good for writing books or, you know, creating jobs for some people, but we don't have to take that for granted. Man, female, you know, everything, normativities, all kind of normativities needs play into that. And so the work is to question identities. I mean, who defines identity, what institution, and here the church has a big role. You know, in history, we have created normalities. We have created, you know, what is in a way acceptable and not acceptable, social conformity and all that thing. So, so just politics, economics, normativities, human resources, the earth. This is a huge thing. The earth, nature. I mean, everything is interconnected. I mean, honestly, I mean, it's okay right now. Black lives matters, but honestly, I mean, the earth matters too, because we're not going to have any life if we don't have an ecosystem. And in that sense, we cannot be simply trivialized by saying we're going to solve this issue because this is this issue. This is one of the issues. The other is also an issue, and we need to work as we work together with the Native Americans as well that are dealing with that, and with the monopolies that are creating in African American people, Native Americans, Latino browns, commodities, and are putting us to work in their systems against nature. And then we have no land, we have no environment, and then we have to clean up. Who's gonna clean up? Who's gonna do the cleanup job? Who's doing the cleanup job on the streets, on the ocean? I mean, it's all interconnected. So I think decolonization, the decolonial approach has to do with delinking ourselves for everything that is in a way dehumanizing, is devaluing our environment, is perpetuating ignorance and hierarchies. And it's a moment, I would say, it's a transitional tactic if you want to, I mean, my opinion is the decolonial and decolonization is a tactic that we need right now because everything is part of a colonial order. So once that colonial order is transformed, the so-called decolonization might take a different name and might take a different shift. But right now, it's really, in a way, it's making life at the erasures of whatever is colonial, whatever is monopolic, whatever is hierarchical, that is creating, in a way, a system in which we have to react the way we are reacting. And for some people, Jemar, you know that the way we are reacting on the streets, it's, and I'm going to use a word that is very interesting, barbarian. We're barbarian. Because civility, you see what I'm saying? This interesting word. Civility doesn't happen the way it is happening right now. So barbarian. So we're barbarians because we're on the street. That's interesting for me, how the word is used. Perhaps we need to go back to a barbarian, you know, theology, a barbarian form of existence in which, you know, we need to undo a little bit of that. And by that, I hope you understand what I'm saying. If the Greek says this is barbarian, then the Roman says this is barbarian. Then the European, Western Europe said this, when the Spaniard said this is barbarian. Then the European said this is barbarian. And now the United States says this is barbarian. So the barbarian is somebody else that it doesn't look like me. And at the end of the day, we're all like that in one way or another.
Jemar, can you give us one thing that you're hopeful for just now?
So you mentioned before imagination, and that's one thing I'm hopeful for, is that these times of intense tension tend to broaden and expand our prophetic imagination, but also our political and our social imagination as well. And so you can look at this pandemic and how we passed the largest relief bill in US history, which included direct financial payments to qualifying families, adults and their children. And so that's a highly fraught political issue on any other day. But in the midst of a crisis, all of a sudden it becomes possible. And so I'm wondering, in the midst of this crisis of police brutality and anti-Blackness and white supremacy, as people are recognizing it, might it expand our imagination of what is possible in the way we do life together, in the way we would maneuver as neighbors and people across racial and ethnic lines. So I'm hopeful about that. I'm also hopeful in the interest in history. These crisis moments always sort of call us back to the lessons of the past. And so people are rightfully looking to historians and people who have studied the past for instruction on how we got here and what we might learn from the voices of the past. I'm also hopeful about a potentially lasting multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition. I think any 21st century movement is going to be led by people of color. And I see that on the streets right now. I see white people joining, but the most encouraging part is that they're following, and they're following the people of color, the Black and brown people in particular, who have lived this and who've been doing this work for a long time. So those are a few things that make me hopeful.
Great, thank you. And Oscar, for you, what are you hopeful for? But can you also speak specifically to, in terms of, as one immigrant, another immigrant, how the shaping dynamics and demographics of the US and how that will play into how this and how that changing demographic will shape the future?
I am very hopeful of the Spirit of God that is in the streets. I mean, I went last time I went to a manifestation here, I met the Spirit there. Sometimes I don't find it with the same intensity in the church, in the organized church, but in the church that walks, or simply in, and I'm in this. I mean, I'm not trying to be mystical or something like that. I went and what I felt when I was seeing this high schooler freshman there in a majority white, neighborhood, when with anti-Nazi I mean, exposing themselves. I saw something moving them. I saw something moving them. I mean, it's not just the style. I mean, many things move them, but one of the things that moves them, I believe, is the Spirit of God that is on the streets. It is the energy that is moving some of these, people. This generation will need to take into their own hands the next changes. It's not going to be us. We're gonna have to be voices cheering the cloud of witnesses, right? Helping them walk, but they're gonna have to take it on. The challenges, that are part of this generation, that includes really the deep current of racism and patriarchy and anti-immigration or xenophobia. The xenophobia. I think that's one thing. There's one thing that I believe is happening from the immigrant perspective. You know that several immigrants are returning home? They have a lot of deception in the United States. I mean, they're fleeing. They thought they were coming to the land that flows milk and honey. They really did, because that's what we sell in the majority world, right? And some people are saying, well, probably the North is not that pristine and as I thought. So I better try to see how I make it, even in another place. People are bypassing to Canada, clearly, many. But I see a rethinking of the ideal country, from the South, saying, I don't think that country is what I thought it was. That's good. It's a little bit of a reality check. It's a little bit of a reality check. I see more immigrant pastors that were not willing to take the risk of being politically incorrect, taking the risk of being politically incorrect and really embracing and really speaking to racism, which, for an immigrant pastor, first generation that comes from Latin America, we had racism over there. So it's not really a topic. It's a different topic. It's kind of a more intuitive, but they're speaking into that. I've seen people, educated, second generation Latinos, pretty much, into awareness. They're becoming aware. They're defending justice, the racial justice, cognitive justice. And by that, they're saying, I am also part of that injustice. I mean, I've been part of that. I've had it. So they're becoming aware of that. They're becoming agents. So there's a lot of agency. And even in the first generation, as in the millennials, as I said, the junior high schooler, and high schooler, they're talking with their parents. What's going on? All this, we never thought. So there's a lot of conversation. I see there's hope in that. White allies that are asking for help in terms of, okay, I want to listen and I want to walk with you. I think that's very helpful. I see that. I live in California, so perhaps that's a little convenient, because over here we can have a little bit more ideological freedom, if I may, that some other places, without much consequences. And so I think I see hope in that sense. And I see hope in small institutions that are really saying, no, we're not going to tolerate this. We're going to lose money, but we're going to change. I've seen that.
Well, thank you. To kind of set up our last question here for the day. Today, we're talking to you from Memorial Presbyterian Church, which is one of the oldest churches in West Palm Beach, an historic white church. I work at Palm Beach Atlantic University. Was started by Southern Baptists, although it's not a Baptist school, so it's another historic white evangelical institution. Our phones have kind of been ringing off the hook. We've been getting texts from folks, mainly white folk, knowing that we're kind of engaged in some of these conversations, asking, that question often comes up, kind of, what do we do? How to respond to this moment? You've talked a lot about community. You've talked about kind of coalitions. How do people respond on that local level? You know, who are maybe they've gone to a protest for the first time. Maybe they've seen the protests on TV and they felt moved of, okay, I've got to get involved now. What should they do? So Jemar, why don't we start with you?
So you mentioned that some people are just being sort of catalyzed right now, and I'm not upset by that, really. I mean, if you're early in your journey, you're early in your journey. There are many questions about why now in 2020, when you had every other opportunity to get involved, but here you are. Now, what do you do? Number one, learn from the people who have been doing this work. So I don't want us to lose the focus of this moment. We can't do everything right now, but I'm hearing a lot of conversations that are ranging very far afield when the specific issue that brought out this particular set of uprisings was about anti-Black police brutality. And so when I say learn from those doing the work, I'm saying learn from people who have been working on police reform and police change for years and years now. The Angela Davises of the world, for example. But there are other organizations, anything from reform organizations like Campaign Zero to organizations that are dedicated to bringing awareness about not just policing, but incarceration, like the Marshall Project and the Appeal. So if you're new to this, find those who are not new to this and learn from them. But here's the problem. I think we need a holistic approach to racial justice. And the problem is that we often stop or primarily focus on raising awareness and building our knowledge. And so that's reading the books, watching the documentaries, listening to podcasts and videos like this one. That's great. Don't take that away, but add to it. And that's where the arc of racial justice model that I developed comes into play. And it's an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. I talk about this in the last chapter of The Color of Compromise, and it is the entire subject of my next book, How to Fight Racism, which is available for pre-order right now. And basically, these are not a step-by-step process. All of these things need to be happening at once. But as you're building your awareness, you should also be building relationships. And so if you're white, you got to look at what I think is a great litmus test is look at your Facebook page and all the pictures that you've posted there, or maybe it's Instagram, and because you'll get a really good sense of your social network and how racially and ethnically diverse your social network is. A lot of Christians in particular put all the emphasis for diversity on Sunday. What does our congregation look like for these couple of hours, one day a week? But they aren't looking at Monday through Saturday and whether they're living truly integrated lives with diverse relationships that will help them understand the pain and the pressure that Black people feel with every potential encounter with law enforcement. And it's not just Black people, right? We need to be developing relationships with all kinds of different people from different racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. But then again, a lot of people like to stop at relationships, right? Because if some of my best friends are Black, then clearly I'm not racist. But that's a flawed way of thinking because there's systemic and institutional issues that have to be addressed. We have to understand that racism works not just on a personal level, but on a policy level too. And so, you know, one of my great apprehensions right now is that all these individuals, even all these organizations that are putting out statements, is not going to cause them to re-examine what policies they support and the impact of these policies on racial and ethnic minorities. So if this doesn't affect your politics, if this doesn't affect your stances on issues of historic and systemic and institutional racism, then honestly, I'd prefer you to be quiet and to get out of the way, because there are people who are trying to make strides in this work. And if all you're doing is mouthing pious irrelevancies, then you're slowing us down. And if you're not willing to do the work to commit to policy change, then it's going to actually be counterproductive and almost better that you didn't get involved in the first place. So those are some things that I think need to bear in mind as we consider what to do.
That was very good, Jemar. Thank you. I think the idea of simply doing kind of what we call it mission trips, mission tourism. You will go there and you will go to El Salvador, build a couple of houses, come back and say, you know, I'm doing mission. Then I cannot speak with the Salvadorian that is around the corner here because she's in crappy conditions. So it's counterproductive, as you say. Thank you. Speaking of experience, in 2016, we did in Southern California, El Camino del Immigrante, the walk of the immigrant. And we did that to do several things. And what I saw happening there is 11 days, we walked all the way from Tijuana to downtown LA to the immigration center to make a manifestation in front of the what is called Homeland Security. And we did. For 11 days, we walked through the most beautiful places of Orange County, the wealthy and, you know, healthy place. And people were saying, what are you guys doing? It was hot. It was difficult. I learned several things there. I met people in the most conservative spectrum that were joining. And I would ask them, why'd you join? You know what? I'm not in favor of this. But there is something that said to me, unless you join, walk, listen, talk, try to have conversation, critical dialogue, expose, listen, I'm not going to be certain if what I believe is the truth or not. And so a lot of things happened along the way. I think in the Christian tradition, we have this Emmaus way. Things happen in the way. So whatever you can do to create a walking mechanism where people actually stop reading and begins walking. Mm. When people actually stop the private sector and becomes more into the public sector, then you will find that you're creating a process that cultivates sensibility, but then it doesn't stop there. It creates awareness, but it doesn't stop there. It creates commitment, but it doesn't stop there. It creates skills, because you need skills to policy change, to mind change, to culture change. So I have found that in our contemporary metropolitan society, walking the streets, doing something that in a way makes you think from the ground, in a way. It's a spiritual exercise of political empowerment. I don't know. I'm just speaking out of experience here. Whatever you can do to really join an action, not just contemplate it from a distance, but join an action and be in community of different people. And you know, you really be honest to say, you know what, I don't even believe in this thing, but I'm here. You know, people, it doesn't matter who you are, they'll respect that. Because they will see you next to them and you're being honest. They'll respect that, and they'll put up with you, with me, and say, you know what, you know, let's walk. And, you know, people will be transformed. There will be more hope in those who are walking and more conviction in those who've never walked. I would say that's important.
That's right.
I mean, we have to do so much work to just find people that are different from us to walk along the road together. That every factor at play, whether it be like whatever news channel we listen to, where our house is, and where we buy our groceries, all these systems play into the fact that we work, live, and do leisure beside people who look like us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the advice. It reminds me of a conversation when I was serving in Colombia and with another pastor. He said he would often tire of the missionaries whose advice was always to give him a book, to read a book to solve his problems. And he was like, you know, he appreciated the book, but it was kind of that kind of white text-based culture that thinks you can solve everything by making a statement or kind of writing it out, or what the written Bible says, and forgetting that so much part of the Christian practice is something that's communal practices that we do together, and that you really can't get to know people or to know what they suffer, what their fears are, what their hopes are, without walking with them and being along with them. And that really, you know, I think good theology is contextually done along the way. That's a good reminder, I think, for white folk who often forget that, who are so quick to, if I can just Twitter it out or get it here or this, I've declared I'm not racist. And so I've done that bit now, but that's not really anything. You haven't really taken a step. Yeah. As
much as we have to like decolonize our structures and our systems, as we have to decolonize our reactions and our thinking, is that they're so Western that it's just from birth. This is how we are trained to think and react to the world that we live.
Yeah.
There is a lot of Western, and by the way, there's a lot of Western, spaces that are so non-hegemonic that sometimes we need to recover those things. That's what I mean. One of the big challenges to Western people or Westernized people, doesn't matter your color you are, is to remember this idea of the West as a homogenic thing is a myth. There's a lot of things. There are 5 countries that dominate the whole West. Can be. There are other spaces that are very marginal, that they're doing a lot of. You go to Ireland, there's a lot of revolt in Ireland because there's many people, that. And Spain, the same thing. They're never been one thing, and they will never be. They will have to negotiate, and it's just that we forget. So we need a little bit of reminding ourselves that we're not that one thing, really. That's a construct. We are different, even among those who look the same. And that is a word we only learn when we get in proximity to radically different people, that then we begin to see different, wait a minute, I'm not that exactly the same than the other. So you will see, okay, difference is good.
It just makes me think of Brian Stevenson's quip from Just Mercy is keep proximate, keep hopeful, change can happen. And I think that's a very kind of condensed version of a lot of what you guys have been talking about. Any more you'd like to say, Dr. Long?
No, I mean, just again, thank you very much for taking the time. I think these are we've kind of said these are very pregnant times. I think there's possibilities and hope, but they're also kind of scary times as well. Thank you for taking the time to help give us some direction and to speak to hopefully the people who will be watching this as they kind of figure out, how they're going to respond to, I think, this important moment.
Well, this is getting together with y'all three is always fun for me. It's like one of the few occasions when I'm asked to speak, but I end up taking way more notes than I ever articulate or speak myself. So I'm always learning from you, and I appreciate this opportunity to speak into this really, I think, critical moment and perhaps a turning point and a crossroads, God willing, and the Holy Spirit bringing the winds of change.
Amen.
Amen.
And Jemar, thank you for being you.
Oh,
thank you.
Appreciate that, brother.
Thank you for being you, and just do whatever you can, man. Don't do more, don't do less. Just what you can. Keep being you, because we need you around for a lot of time.
Amen. Well, I respect you so much. And so those words mean a whole lot to me and are extremely encouraging. Thank you.
Well, thank you again so much. Thanks, Jemar, and muchas gracias, Oscar, for taking the time.